The famous German poet Bertolt Brecht once said, "First comes the eating, then the morale." So hunger and poverty are still bigger threats for millions of people than climate change. Today's bread is more important for them than sustainable economy tomorrow. But hunger and climate change will become more and more two sides of the same medal. Let's talk about priorities. Welcome to the panel, Financing Our Survival, Climate Justice.
So thank you for coming to this very important panel. And we have a wonderful group of panelists, ministers, prime ministers, heads of states. So I feel really honored to be here with all of them. We would like to talk today at this panel about climate justice. And I will talk about climate justice. I would like just to give you a quick introduction. Climate justice in two ways, which is justice between countries. We often talk about, is the North treating the South in a just way? But we also need to talk about justice within countries, within societies. Are there certain groups that are more impacted by climate? We've seen women, for example, being more impacted by climate, or are farmers more impacted by climate than others, and how can we ensure climate justice within societies as well as between societies? I will speak for 2 or 3 minutes, and then I know you want more to hear the panelists than myself, but I would like to start by talking about justice between countries. And it is extremely important to discuss financing, obviously. And how are we going to be financing the climate action in the global south? You've heard in the previous panel when they said we're reaching the 100 billion that was promised. And Sir Ashok said, 100 billion is not enough. It's actually the 100 billion that everybody's talking about is nowhere near enough. You know what is needed for the global south in financing for climate action. And I talk about the global south excluding China, because China is just such a huge part. So excluding China, what is needed is not 100 billion, it's 2,400 billion every year. This 2,400 billion, so it's 2.4 trillion, the largest part of it is for mitigation, which is 1,800 billion every year is the investment is needed for mitigation. The mitigation part is energy transition and natural capital and agriculture, with the biggest chunk being the energy transition, 1.5 trillion every year that is being needed. The remainder, which is 600 billion, is for adaptation and for loss and damage and for just transition. So these are the quantities, these are the magnitudes that we are looking at. So when people talk about 100 billion, it's not going to take us very far. We need 2,400 billion every year. That's why I say that we need really to think completely outside of the box. None of our existing institutions or existing mechanisms is capable of delivering $2,400 billion every year for climate action. Yesterday, there's a lot of talk about asking the multilateral development banks, the World Bank should finance. Well, I was vice president of the World Bank for 7 years. The World Bank delivers 100 billion of financing every year. There's no way the World Bank will deliver 2,400 billion a year. And even if it put all its money, I was reading an ODI report last night, which showed that they looked at they were asking politicians and leaders in developing countries, what would you like the World Bank to finance? The top 2 items are education and health. Climate comes very low down the list. So I suggest that we might want to consider creating something different, something like a green bank, which would replace the existing. Right now, there are 62 climate funds in the world. 62 climate funds in the world, multilateral climate funds of the world. They deliver between $2 and $5 billion a year, peanuts. So you need to replace all of that by one big green bank that can actually mobilize resources from the private sector, from governments, from civil society, and have a very different governance structure, very different way of working from the existing multilateral system. I should not talk. So that is one point I wanted to make about justice between countries. The amount of financing that is needed is huge, and whatever we're doing right now is a drop in the bucket. Now, quickly, another point on justice between countries is that we're heading towards a debt crisis. Many countries now in the global south are facing problems with debt. Why don't we consider putting in place a mechanism of debt for climate swaps that actually works? Like we did HIPIX at the end of the 20th century, why don't we do something similar where you use reduce debt against climate investments? We need to look also at justice within countries. And there will be a lot of discussions about what's happening in countries and what's happening especially on the gender issues. I wanted just to make a point about how, because since I've been following what's happening with the farmers in Europe over the last few weeks, and the protests by farmers in Europe, especially with regards to protests against some of the environmental rules of the Commission. Now, I understand their position because it is unfair to ask farmers to do additional work for climate. It's costing them, it's making them less competitive. Many years ago, when I was working at FAO, we had suggested that instead of subsidizing production, why don't we pay farmers for environmental services? We're asking farmers to do certain things for the environment and for climate. Why don't you pay them for it? So those are the 2 points. I just couldn't help myself but make them at the very beginning. But now let me pass right away to our panelists. And Ugochi, you will start.
Thank you very much. And good morning to everyone here. It's really an honor to be part of such a distinguished panel. And my job today, I'm actually going to start off where the previous panel ended, and there was a question on what's the one thing that we want from COP. So for the UN Migration Agency, we're about people. And we want a COP, if it's a finance COP, we want a COP that is going to be inclusive for the most vulnerable. Because what we see today is that people and the most vulnerable groups have to be at the center of climate action. They're the ones most impacted, and at the same time, they're the ones less prepared and less able to adapt or mitigate the impact of climate. And we know that about 3.6 billion people in the world right now are living in highly vulnerable climate hotspots, as they're called. If we zoom in to the least developed countries, landlocked developed countries, and small island developing states, they produce 4% of CO2 emissions. But for the past 50 years, 70% of the deaths due to climate events happen in these countries. So they are paying a significant burden for the impact of climate. And when we're speaking about death, it's actually the ultimate burden. And what we know is that the gaps between where adaptation is happening and where the investments are made and where it needs to be made is that there's a significant gap, and that gap is going to is going to continue to grow. And even when you look at where ODA is going, extremely fragile contexts receive a much lower proportion of assistance, only 6%, actually is targeting adaptation. So you were speaking about the gap between the resources needed and what's available. Even what is available is not effectively financing adaptation for the most vulnerable. So I'm not just here to admire the problem, I want to offer some solutions. And the first of which is the financial instrument within the UNFCCC, the Loss and Damage Fund. IOM, along with many others here in the room, very much welcome the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund and the symbol of global solidarity by the initial commitments to the fund that are made. But what is special about this fund, and no other fund does this, is that it has a window called Community Direct Access Window of the fund for subnational and local actors, in particular those in affected windows. In affected communities. So when we're talking about women, youth, indigenous communities, people with disabilities, this window specifically targets them. And the strongest advocates on the impact of climate on vulnerable people are those most affected. So again, the least developed countries, the landlocked, and the SIDS, and they are the ones who recognize the positive role of migrants in the development of their communities through remittances. And at the last COP, I had the opportunity to speak with the diaspora, to speak with migrant associations, and they were saying, we're the ones that are paying for loss and damage. We're the ones that are paying for the impact of climate. When there's emergency, they're the first set of inflows. We saw it during COVID. We've seen it after the impact of disasters. And the role that remittances, the role that migration is playing in being part of the solution. So one solution there is the window in the Loss and Damage Fund for these vulnerable, the most impacted groups. The second solution that I have is an example of a public-private structure that will help address inequalities, and it's blended finance to catalyze climate investments. So the Green Financing Facility in North Macedonia, funded by the UN SDG Fund, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the government, and implemented by UNDP IOM, the bank, and UNECE, it provides performance-based payments to private sector banks to incentivize them to provide subsidized loans to small and medium-scale enterprises and households to adopt renewable energy and energy efficiency solutions, and it specifically targets female-headed households, single-parent households, people with disabilities, remittance recipient households. So such initiatives, when designed and implemented, can really ensure that the financing is empowering those most in need to take for the capacity for adaptation. And we are certainly going to continue to advocate for actors to scale up good public-private structures and mechanisms for the poorest, for the most vulnerable, and in the most fragile countries. And I'll end with the point about, you had spoken about like the HIPIC model. For those who were in the plenary session yesterday, you would have heard the director of UNAIDS speaking about the fact that many of the countries most impacted by climate are spending 4 to 10 times more on interest payments than they are in health and education. And at the heart of building resilience and being able to adapt are investments in health and education. So I will close with that. And if you don't remember anything, please remember the importance of having people at the center.
Thank you very much, Ugochi. And thank you for sticking to the 5 minutes. I hope that we'll be able to have a second round where everybody will be able to speak again. I'm going to jump right away to Prime Minister and ask him to take the floor. Prime Minister Yildirim, who was Prime Minister of Turkey, and he was Speaker of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. I jumped right to him because he will have to leave us earlier than the other panelists. So maybe, Excellency, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Yes, the first day, we discussed about fractured world, how to fix it, and also realpolitik, war and peace. Actually, these are the hard issues we talking about in our region as well as in globe. But today, to my understanding, more important topic we are discussing. This is nothing to do with between individual countries. This is related to whole humanity. If we define as a war, this war's against our globe. So we need to fight, we need to find solution how to reduce green gas effect, which we generate for many, many years. What is the source of the green gas emission? By sectors. When we look at the picture, energy comes first. The second, transportation, all kind, maritime, aviation, land transportation, industry, agriculture, use of land and forestry, building, housing, building house and building cities and communities, and finally, waste management. When we look at this, each item, what is the situation globally? Naturally, developed countries much more responsible of climate change than less developed countries, because they are industrial-wise is well ahead. Also energy sectors and others, all I listed, they are well ahead from less developed countries or countries under development. So who is going to pay the bill? This is a big question today in terms of reducing carbon emission and make our globe much better to live. As we all know, the Paris Agreement in 2015 signed, and Türkiye has implemented this agreement. Paris Agreement under United Nations Framework Climate Change Convention aiming combating climate change, but does not mandate any carbon tax where this is the job of countries, how they implement, reduce carbon emission. Carbon pricing tax, one way, other one, emission trading. So, which means whatever you produce in your country, the use of energy and other things, you generate carbon dioxide, gas emission. So the amount of this gas emission, if it is high, when you sell these commodities to another countries or someone, you are obliged to pay tax, which means trading your commodities, your products, will be much difficult than before, and international regional cooperation will be disadvantage for you. So this is an important point. We have to think about that. What I am saying is the price should be paid fairly and justly, not paid by underdeveloped or less developed countries, because they are not the cause of climate change. They suffer consequence of climate change. That's why the fighting against global warming and climate change requires international standards set by United Nations and other related organizations. Otherwise, there will be mess. What is going to happen? Should I stop?
If you can. Yes.
Okay. Maybe second round. I'll touch a little bit other subject. You know, the climate change, not today, but maybe 5 years' time, will be very hot issue, even worse than the war. So we have to do something urgently.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And actually, this is the second time this morning we hear about the importance of carbon pricing. So I think it's a very important point. And when I suggested the Green Bank, I was also thinking that it can play a role in creating a carbon market. Let me move right away to our host, Minister Elnur Aliyev, who is the first Deputy Minister of Economy here in Azerbaijan.
Thank you so much. Good morning. It's a privilege and honor to be here and to be among esteemed panelists here. The topic of climate change, it's not just an environmental issue, it's also about fairness and justice. Some nations are feeling its effects much more than others, especially those who are facing development difficulties. When we talk about the climate justice, it's essential that we recognize and tackle disparities extended by climate finance. As our esteemed moderator mentioned, about 2,400 billion USDs annually needed to face the climate change issues in the global south on one hand. On the other hand, just a year ago, the government spent more than 7,000 billion USDs on subsidies for SMEs due to the increase in the energy sources. Once again, it shows the contrast, what we say and what we do generally in the world. Another point is that failure to meet the 2009 promise of transferring 100 billion annually to help poorer nations to combat climate change. What we have done so far as a government here regarding the challenges we face in the world. Clean environment and green growth identified as one of five priority areas of our national development strategy. On the international stage, Azerbaijan's active participation in COP initiatives illustrates our efforts in fighting climate change. In aligning the major points of national and international approaches, we made a decision that the climate finance should be a central focus of COP29 to be held here in order to catalyze the mobilization of climate finance. Over the past decades, our country has witnessed a remarkable economic transformation. Threefold increase in GDP, significant reduction in poverty, declining from 49% to an impressive 5.5%. With low external public debt, it's around 10% of GDP last year. Existing financial opportunities have reached the historic peak, further promoted our position among the upper middle income group of countries. We are actively making transition toward green energy, serving as a catalyst for the green energy transformation. Renewable energy sources predicted to constitute 24% for electricity generation in Azerbaijan by 26, with a more ambitious target of reaching 30% by 2030. We also aim for a significant reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2050. This includes the establishment of a green energy zone in liberated territories. Identifying this year as a year of solidarity for a green world, our renewable energy projects have demonstrated positive performance. The launch of Azerbaijan's first 230 megawatts solar power plant in last year represents just the beginning. By 2030, our goal is to generate up to 5 gigawatts of solar and wind energy, facilitated by partnership with leading companies such as Masdar and Aqua Power. In the future, we aim to use potential renewable energy sources both on land and in the Caspian Sea to become a major exporter of green energy globally. While we value renewable energy, we also recognize that fossil fuels will still be important for some time. Therefore, it's important to fairly evaluate the environmental efforts and transition to green energy of countries rich in fossil fuels without unfair discrimination. In the framework of COP29, we're ready to take a commitment to increase our contributions to climate finance architecture, such as North-South climate finance mechanism, to help mobilize resources for climate-resilient projects in developing countries. It's best time as an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to addressing climate change and closing the green finance gap. And therefore, we offer all of us, let's work together to mobilize the resources needed to build more sustainable world for future generations. Together we can make a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we move right away to Irina Bokova, who was the Director General of UNESCO. Irina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Nizami Ganjavi Center for inviting me. It's an important, fascinating, I think, 2 days, talking about multilateralism, talking about climate. And I believe it is not by chance that this year we have 2 major events. Of course, it's COP29, which will be preceded by the summit on the future we want, convened by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. And it really reminds me about 2015, when we adopted the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think it was not by chance that these 2 processes, because it was a process, and now it is a process also, are linked. It is not by chance that in the Agenda 2030 there is the goal number 13 on climate. It showed that you cannot separate development, sustainable development, from climate. And from the very beginning, I had looked at that as one agenda. And I think all the attempts to kind of just pose themselves is very unproductive. Albeit we know that there are tensions, but the problem is that unless we look at them in their totality, will we not achieve the result that we want. Now, when I speak that there should be looked in totality, I come to the question that sometimes people ask, do you choose education or climate? I think just the question is wrong. We want both. And this is the idea behind the SDG agenda, because it is not one or another goal, it's in their totality. And I think we have to continue looking at them not just in silos, but in their comprehensive impact on people, because it's agenda by the people, for the people. And the second, which is very much linked to the title of our debate here about justice, it is about leaving no one behind. And it is about the most vulnerable. Long gone are the times when climate was looked as an agenda of some middle-class elites in the global north, as it started all this debate, green parties and others. Now we know that it impacts the most vulnerable. And here, I would like just to make 3 points, if you allow me quickly. Now, when we say the most vulnerable, I think we started already talking. Of course, it is women, because we know that out of the 1.3 billion, I think, poor people in the world, 70% are women, and they bear the burden of energy, providing for their families. It's about food security also. This is this nexus that is so important to be debated. And unless we look at that from that point of view, and we just go down into more details about what we're talking about, this big financing, about this big picture, and I like very much what Maimona Sharif said, we have to go local, we have to see actually in communities what is happening. And when we prepare our big national plans, NDCs or LDCs and all the others, it has to trickle down really to the real life, to the real reality check that we were talking. And I think there is money in the world. It's about political choices. There is money for development. If we take all the stakeholders, of course, the private sector, the development banks, and the others, it's really a matter about political choices. My second point, because we discussed with President Joyce Banda yesterday, and I have a big respect for her leadership in Malawi. I was in Malawi when she was a president, and I know how much she has done for the development of the country, for girls' education. And yesterday we tackled this issue once again. It is about education, because you asked whether we choose education or climate. Nothing will happen without education. Nothing. It's a foundation of everything we are doing. It's a foundation of sustainable development. It's a foundation of changing our lifestyles, education for sustainable development, green jobs. We spoke just a while ago that if we want to have the transition and to have renewable energy, renewable sector, there is lack of capacity. They have to be prepared, the green jobs for the future, which are not there. And we know, because Secretary General Guterres convened another important summit last year and a half ago, on the future of education, transforming education. It's a crisis. It's a crisis even, I would say, before COVID, and now it's a bigger crisis. Because 1 out of 3, you know, by 2030, United Nations Women has seen that another 150 million women will go into poverty, and the majority of them will be illiterate, and there are more than 650 children which will be going out of school, and practically, because of poor quality education and all this, they do not know how to write and read. They will not read our big projects and strategies that we are devising. So education is really fundamental. And education, once again, for girls. Because if we don't do that, I think we will not give justice and they will be condemned to poverty. My third point, I put my another hat, which is as a patron of the International Science Council. And I know tomorrow there will be more discussion on this with the Salvatore Enrico, who I think is here in the room, the CEO of International Science. It's about science. And during the last 2 years with my friend and former colleague Helen Clark, we have been working, co-chairing a global commission on science-led sustainability missions. Because science gives the answers to many of these questions. We know we speak about technology, but we should speak also about science. When I say science, I say all science, social, natural, applied, you know, everything that is there and what science can contribute. And what we have proposed is a new model of financing of science. I think it falls within the question about financing. We want to have at least $1 billion, which is just tiny, I would say, part, 0.3% of all the R&D in the world, that goes to creating this kind of hubs we propose, actionable science, that allows countries to look at the SDG agenda and climate and how they can be really be given this solution.
Thank you very much, Irina. You notice I didn't dare stop her even after she went beyond 5 minutes. Now, let me go right away to Prime Minister Yves Leterme, former Prime Minister of Belgium. Yves, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to the Azerbaijan nation for having me here and having the opportunity to take the floor here. Then a disclaimer, I'm not a specialist in the matter. I worked on budgets and I worked on all kinds of policies, but not specifically on sustainability and environmental issues. So let me put forward 5 elements of the Belgian position, which is, as usual, very close to the European Union position in terms of how to approach the later to hold COP meetings here in Azerbaijan. Congratulations to Azerbaijan for having the COP29 here. 5 features of the position and then 5 elements that in the background, I think, play out and have a lot of impact on what is really happening. The number 1 element when I talk about the 5 crucial elements of our position, number 1 is we all agree within the very complex Belgian structures that more should be done, of course. We have seen quite an important increase, but we have to triple, quadruple, multiply by 5 the volume that is needed. And Belgium is ready to take its share part of the effort. I will come back to more figure-related issues later. The number 2 is that we also all agree that there is still something rotten in the geography of the use of money that is put on the table and that is available. I think within the Union, certainly after the so-called Green Deal and the new funds that were launched to reboost the economy, also the changes in the mandate of institutions like the European Investment Bank, also the contributions by the European Union to the international financial institutions. A lot has been done. We see same developments, very impressive in China, US, Brazil, India joining, Japan, the Far East Asia. And it's of course fair to say that there's not sufficient money available, as was said eloquently by preceding colleagues, for the poorest nations, the island states, Africa, Latin America, and so on. So we are ready to talk about how to increase or how to change a little bit this geography. Number three, in terms of use, almost 90% of the money now is used to work on mitigation of effects. And it would be fairer, if we talk about fair climate policies and climate justice, it would be more just to give a priority to adaptation, very urgently, be it at the national level in developed economies, but certainly also in developing nations and developing economies. So this 90% for mitigation should be much lower, and the adaptations should go up. And so we're ready to support, both as Belgium as European Union, all kinds of new initiatives in that field. Four, in terms of domains, we have a lot of low-hanging fruit that has been, let's say, harvested in the field of energy and transportation. And there is a kind of unleashed general dynamic in the field of energy, to a certain extent in transportation, and as far as we see the thing, we should improve our performance in the field of industry, buildings, and agriculture, forestry, and meat production in the world. Last but not least, important to know, of course, that time is working against us, and this means that the business as usual scenario more and more comes to the front as something which could be understood by the citizenry also, that there's no alternative than to invest in adaptation and, of course, mitigation, but first of all in adaptation, and invest money in stronger climate policies. Invest more. 5 remarks once we've gone through the essential elements of our positions. Number one, and I will not quote Jean-Claude Trichet, but he very rightly stated yesterday that we have to tackle inflation, that it is time now for putting some order in our budgetary policies. More restrictive budgetary policies and restrictive monetary policies means that the money available becomes rare, but not rare, but at least not so affluent as it has been. Number two, we are facing lots of other challenges. Some we can't avoid, the price of the aging of population in mature economies in the European Union. Some we should try to avoid, the enormous amount of money that apparently is needed to safeguard our security in defense policies, military expenditure. My country spends now something more than 1.2 GDP to the military investment in our security and our, let's say, obligations in the framework of NATO. We are asked to double this in a period of 5 to 8 years, which means a crowding out effect. Not to always point at my country, I read last week the 10 billion that in France urgently had to be found to, let's say, not to balance the budget, but to limit the negative developments in the field of the budget. Well, a very important part of this 10 billion was found in development aid, cuts in the field of development aid. Number three, the price of war and conflict. So war and conflicts are terrible for the climate change policy and for producing more emissions and just factually reducing our chance to meet the 1.5 target. So this adds to the reasons to invest in efficient multilateral action to limit the number of wars, number of armed conflicts. Last but not least, and there I refer to what Irina has been saying in terms of education, we think there are some wins in 2 domains. Number one is the behavior of citizens. First, from my personal point of view, I lived recently, over the last 10 years, I lived 5 years in Sweden, 2 years in Belgium, and 3 years in France. I can tell you that the behavior of people in Sweden, France, and Belgium is totally different when they go to the supermarket, asking or not for a plastic bag, when they use their car instead of public transport, when they talk about how the surroundings of their house should be organized, the use of concrete instead of natural stuff, and so on. So the behavior, the education also that plays a role in changing the behavior of people. Last element, and I conclude, I think it's a totally different domain, that it is very negative for the effectiveness of climate policy, what we've been seeing unfolding in the field of global trade, reshoring, decoupling, putting tariffs on electric vehicles, putting extra tariffs on solar panels, hindering the cooperation in the field of scientific, fundamental and applied research, is negative in terms of finding out solutions, and is negative in terms of, as far as global trade is concerned, tariffs are negative in terms of the access for ordinary citizens to use and to buy tools that can help individually and collectively to tackle the issue of climate change. So I leave it there. I think I went a little bit beyond the time limits, but that was what I wanted to share.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Leterme. And now we move right away to President Ameenah, who was President of Mauritius. And in addition to being an important African leader, Ameenah is also a scientist. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to thank, of course, the Azerbaijan government for the welcome. And I'm a regular now to Baku, and I find that the quality of the debate is really getting better, and it's really touching on some of the key major issues, which of course is affecting our world. And we are here on this panel discussing the climate. And I must say something up front. When I listen to this debate, I sometimes wonder we are still sharing the same planet. There is this kind of narrative of it's us and them. Them being, of course, me, coming from the global south, where 85% of the world population lives. And we all agree that climate change is a threat. And I think it came to bear in Paris when we had the COP21. This is when the time we realized that we have a common problem, but the approach had to be differentiated. And unfortunately, over the past few years, the word differentiated has gone under the radar. And the differentiated approach means precisely sharing of resources, making available this 100 billion. 100 billion is still not capitalized, and I can't help thinking of the when we go to London, we hear the sentence, mind the gap. The gap is still there. 100 billion has not been capitalized. Now, let us put this down, let's put it down to the world economy. The world economy is going almost 100 trillion. What is 100 billion when you think about it in terms of figures? And yet, world leaders cannot come to actually capitalize this. Now, the other thing I want to actually put up front, is this charity which is be given to the global south? The answer for me is no. Why? Because if we go to the other COP, the biodiversity COP, we will see the interrelation. We will see how something which will happen in Beijing will have an impact in New York, because we still share the same planet. There is no planet B. Now, if you look at the 100 billion in terms of funding for adaptation, I mean, it is nothing. And as Mr. Moderator had just said, in terms of needs for the global south, we are talking about 1 trillion excluding China. So 100 billion peanuts. But where are we going to go in terms of development? Now, if you look at a continent like Africa, Africa will have a population of almost 2 billion by 2050. So what are we going to put down in terms of development if we are going to address the challenges that Africa will have? Why I put Africa? Because Africa is a continent which is growing, the population is growing. Africa holds over on average, 30% of the world reserve of most things, minerals, you name it, it's all there. But Africa is a continent which has not polluted, which has contributed less than 3% in terms of global emission. And now if we look at what's happening in terms of global trade, we find increasingly global trade is being linked to clean technology. Now, how will Africa emerge? Developing infrastructure, building high institutions, getting the technology to be able to produce these goods which will reach the market where the benchmarks are. I'm going to be controversial here. I'm going to say Africa needs a carbon window. We need to be able to use our resources to develop, because if you look at the contribution of the global north, because we are talking us and them, global north has contributed over 25% of the emission. So how are we going to grow our economies if we are going to be asked to leapfrog to the next generation of technologies? We simply can't do it. So that's one thing. The other thing I'm going to talk about, precisely, the approach has been incremental since Paris, because we talked about the 100 billion. Then we talked about the Bridgetown Initiative, 500 billion. And this, of course, had been translated into developing this into SDR, the special drawing rights, which has been the model adopted in the past by the IMF. And of course, we should not add to sovereign debt. Then came recently the loss and damage funds. But all these remain empty boxes. The pledges have not been realized. And we need concrete actions. And interestingly, what differentiated the SDGs from the MDGs is the input of the private sector. We need increased contribution from the private sector. Private-public partnership have to be flagged in. But at the same time, Mr. Chair, I will not take too long, we need to create new institutions. The existing multilateral institutions will not be able to meet the needs for the climate fund, whether to host it or whether to be able to actually commit the funds. We need a new institution. I think Mr. Chair mentioned the Green Bank. And here again, the damage fund can be used for using grants to bring down interest on loan, and of course the public sector adaptation fund. So the need is absolutely huge. So what do we need to, where will the funds come if it's not going to come from the private sector? The oil and gas industry could be in the form of, for example, the corporate social responsibility to development. And the other thing that we are increasingly hearing about is this carbon trade. Now, Africa, most of the developing world, where the forests are, they will be involved in this trade. Now, is this trade going to be skewed again? Are we going to see how multilateral institutions have been skewed against the developing world? I mean, this is a fact. I mean, recently we've seen what happened to the WTO, right, for the appeals mechanism. So for how long are institutions going to be skewed against the 85% of the world population? And in terms of accountability, we have heard about the polluting industries, but there are a few industries which still remain under the radar. Last year at Dubai, we've heard about security. Of course, security means military. Who is speaking about the shipping industry? Who is speaking about the fashion industry? They are among some of the big polluters. So we need to bring them on board so that we can actually help capitalize this new green fund, the new green bank, so that we can see more justice. And to come back to Irina's point about women, if you look at women in Africa, they feed the continent. They contribute food on the table. And they are going to be most impacted because once Africa has 60% of the world's arable land, 85% of African agriculture is still rain-fed. Now, with the changing weather cycle, what's going to happen to them if they are not actually empowered with technology, with education, and of course with their support? Because women still they are not able, for example, to open a bank account. They still don't have access to land. So issues of women and men have to be factored in. But I think the last point I would like to make, I would like really to see more convergence between the climate COP and the biodiversity COP. Because if we keep on destroying the environment, we're going to have more tipping point, we're going to have more crisis, we're going to have more migration, and of course, more political problem for the global north. Thank you.
Thank you, President Ameenah. Unfortunately, Prime Minister Yildirim has to leave us. So thank you very much for joining the panel, Prime Minister. Thank you very much. And now we move to President Banda, President of Malawi. And President Banda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, for this opportunity, and let me thank Nizami International Center for the invitation, and thank you very much for the Azerbaijan government for all that you are doing to bring us together. We look forward to COP29. We're coming back. The issue of climate change has been a subject for the last 30 years. So some of us, like myself, up to age 40, I didn't hear anything about COP20, climate change. So there's a whole generation, the 30-year-olds, that have been there while we've been discussing climate change and its negative effects on humanity. I deliberately talk about a whole generation because it is very difficult for me to understand why we are still here. It is very difficult for me to understand that in spite of all, our situation is getting worse. I was here for the Global Summit last year. I was invited to Baku. And while I was here, I got a message from Malawi that it had been hit by Cyclone Freddy. I went running back. Thousands of people died. Villages were swept away. Crops were swept away. The president invited me and appointed me Goodwill Ambassador for recovery, for reconstruction of Malawi. And I've been working tirelessly over the past 12 months trying to correct that. And I want us to note that I'm going to localize and talk about my region. Today, this morning, as I was getting ready to come to this meeting, I got a phone call that on my farm, buildings have been swept away. Another cyclone that has hit Mozambique and that is moving into Malawi. So it is now 4 years continuously getting cyclones, crop failures, lack of food, droughts from Kenya all the way to South Africa. This, for me, cyclones, is the first time I'm seeing them, and I'm 74. So there must be a reason why we are getting them continuously, and they're getting worse. I just wanted me to peg that so that we understand that while we've been talking for 30 years, there must be a reason why we're not making progress. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Zambia has just declared a disaster, a national disaster, because there's drought. The crop has failed. Same with Zimbabwe. Cyclone in Mozambique, and cyclone has hit Malawi today. What does that mean? What that means is that we must reorganize ourselves. We must refocus. We must go back to the drawing board. In the time since I left this place, last year, when the president appointed me Goodwill Ambassador for Reconstruction and Recovery over the Cyclone Freddy, I've built houses with my organization, the Joyce Banda Foundation, in 4 districts, fed 100,000 households. Now today we are hit again, so it means we are back to square one. We get to COP27, COP26, COP21, and we hear about huge amounts of money being pledged. And the question always is, who is accessing this money? Now we are told that there's a task force that's going to look at the guidelines on how countries, poor countries, can access the money. So we're back to that bureaucracy again. My point that I'm pushing is that communities of Africa have waited too long. The world has waited long enough. The world has waited 30 years. And if we are now talking about 2050, then I think I, as the Pan-African champion for climate justice, I must declare that we have failed the world. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, my sister from the UN said we must be people-centered. So since I went back home, I thought the best way for us to move forward is to identify those private sector entities that are willing, that accept that Africa is paying for sins it did not commit, and that they are ready to forge smart partnerships with Africa. We identified one organization and went flat out into villages to empower communities, as my 2-3 sisters have said. I believe that there will be nothing about local communities without them sitting at the table. And this past year, this past COP28 in Dubai, my organization, without wanting to waste your time, the work that we have done at grassroots and turned around grassroots, the strength of those initiatives was the fact that we had the community, the international private sector entity, my organization, Community Development Initiative, and the government as 4 equal partners, but identifying the local communities as the owners of the project and allow them to own the project and allow them to change their situation. So the communities are not just sitting back and waiting for handouts. They are sitting back waiting for us to provide opportunities for them to do their own work. So for me, what we have achieved in those areas is to help communities build decent homes, clean water, environmental management, agribusiness, produce, become food and nutrition secure, a school, a clinic, a church, or a mosque. For me, that is a progressive community, but allowing the communities themselves to implement their own programs. These, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, are the smart partnerships that I'm advocating for, that communities can forge with those of us who call ourselves champions, that we will not just turn up in an area and think we are going to change their lives, but allowing them to change their own situation with our support. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, our project, fortunately, when we went to COP28, we got the Best Project Award in Africa, seconded by Namibia and Rwanda. I'm very proud of that because it is not us at this level, it is a community that achieved that. I would like to say that while we will look at Rio, what did we agree in Paris, Copenhagen, did we agree in Sharm el-Sheikh, some of us want to believe that those organizations of goodwill that are prepared to go into African communities and support them, they must move now. Because of the bureaucracies and the procedures and the time it takes to see one thing happen, we can move communities, we can change their lives, we can help them build resilience and preparedness for things such as cyclones or for these calamities. And if we do that, we will achieve more by 2030 than waiting for guidelines from this task force and that task force and this meeting and that meeting. So what am I saying finally? I am saying, in agreement with my sisters and brothers who have spoken before me, to say that time is now, and some of us are prepared to move with those that are like-minded, taking shortcuts to reach the communities. And if you're ready, let's go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And let us move right away to Prime Minister Roman of Romania. Prime Minister Roman, other than being also important political leader. He's also a scientist. So I'm very eager to hear from him.
Thank you. First, I wish to express my very good feelings about the quality of this year's Baku Forum. Year after year, the Baku Forum became more interesting and of a higher quality. And I think that by now, the Baku Forum is considered widely, globally, as an event of high quality, which is very good for all of us being present here. Indeed, I would like to shed some light from a different perspective. It's my knowledge not as a politician, but as a scientist in the physics of the environment. The climate change effects are making our world, probably much more unpredictable than ever before. And while connecting to the subject of finance, climate change, while markets manage risk probability well, most of the time, they cannot manage uncertainty by themselves. If the institutional arrangements make terrible mistakes. Let me give you an example of the empirical findings of very high value from the climate science. Strong events at once could reinforce or cancel out each other's influence on the global climate change in complex ways. It might be good news in one place, and it might be bad news in somewhere else. One specific example, the pollutants that form aerosol droplets from sulfur dioxide, on one hand, and the carbon pollutants on the other side. The aerosol droplets in the atmosphere have a cooling effect. A cooling effect. Let's remember that about 3 centuries ago, the greatest ever volcano eruption made the world, Europe in particular, that the people then said that they live in a perpetual winter. That was the effect, the cooling effect of those aerosol droplets. And probably, scientists say, the effect is larger than previously assumed. We are actively trying to eliminate these pollutants, I mean sulfur dioxide pollutants, because, of course, they have a very bad effect on the health of people. But in the meantime, we think firmly, and there are many arguments, scientific arguments, that the uncertainties concerning the warming of the planet are and will be narrowed down if less CO2 is emitted. Now just think that if the cooling effect I just mentioned is on the higher side, stronger, there will be more warming because fossil fuels are phased out more and more. You see? phasing out fossil fuels, less pollutants, aerosol pollutants, less cooling, more warming. That's the way the things are. In fact, the unpredictability works. Financing strongly and on long term our policy doesn't necessarily bring the success of the predicted results. And in a contrast with this financing, in that context, we have also fragile social cohesion measures of redistributions are needed, although maybe the climate justice is not completely reached. The adequacy to fundamental climate justice principle is difficult to reach, while very much needed. So, in order to conclude, we place our expectations on the leveling ground which emerges if we are aware of our common destiny. If we really think that there is common destiny, then there is a leveling ground of our expectations, which is meaning doing all the time all the necessary things. But, as I said, there is no such thing as equilibrium, political, economic, financial, and natural. And in conditions of acute uncertainty, exceptional skills are necessary, and I must say a lot of luck. Let me finish. We are, in fact, challenged by randomness and chance. I mean the chance to act now, as Madam the President said, and reduce substantially the space of randomness. Challenged by chance and embracing it is the only road to fulfilling our expectations. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now let us move to Manuel Vidal, who was Minister of Environment of Peru and who is now responsible for climate and energy practice at the Worldwide Fund.
Thank you, Hafez. Look, friends, I am the last in a long list. It's 1 p.m., so I will put all my effort to keep your attention and then to be provocative to move you probably starving to the lunchtime. So, friends, we are here talking about three main topics: climate finance, climate justice, and a fractured world. Those three elements. What are those relations? It is important to be considered. So let me start with a clear statement. The Paris Agreement is and can continue being a perfect deal to reunite the world if we are able to fully implement it. We can reunite the world by continue implementing the Paris Agreement. But with one caveat, Irina, you mentioned it. We are forgetting one of the key principles of the climate debate: to don't leave anyone behind. Probably the most important principle of the climate debate that unfortunately we are not considering it well. So let me share with you some ideas that are related to pending tasks to make the Paris Agreement more effective to this fragmented world. Let me start by talking about net zero. Jean, in the debate that you moderated, you asked a lot, Sharma, about this decision of Shell, of reducing their pledges, their targets, and even their time frame. And why? Why that is happening? Because we haven't yet fulfilled to give content to the net zero system. It is still based in a voluntary basis. It has not already, or it has not yet developed all the content, all the standards, and all what it is needed to make it more mandatory and more enforceable. For sure, it is good that the Paris Agreement brought to us the 1.5, at that time well below 2 degrees, but now it's 1.5, the net zero and the resilience objective. But still, there are many things that we have to develop to make that more enforceable and more mandatory. If not, we will move in circles. There are not any way to point at any country that are not fulfilling with their NDC. There are not by now any way to say to Shell, you have to fulfill with your obligation. It is part of the commitment that we are taking as a world. So that must change, and it was good when Antonio Guterres told in Glasgow, we have to recover credibility. We have to cover that credibility gap. So that is my first point. Second point, whole of society. The only way to continue progressing in our climate objective, it is by continue convening the whole of society, means the whole set of actors. And Hakima mentioned it. It is true, it was in 2014 in Lima when we launched the Lima Paris Action Agenda. And then 2 years after that, it's evolved into the Marrakesh Partnership. Hakima was one of the 2 first champions of the Action Agenda. And Dubai showed with more than 100,000 people how active the Action Agenda currently is. But we have to continue improving that by bringing indigenous people, by defining a more clear cities agenda. You mentioned about localization, Maimuna, during your participation in the former debate. We have to continue promoting a gender and women agenda. We have to continue working with youth. It is the only way to make the Paris Agreement and its objective more achievable. There are a third element. Friends, this is about the economy. You remember that famous phrase of Clinton, no? It's the economy, stupid, no? It's the economy. The Paris Agreement won't or will never punish us, but it will be the economy. I remember a very good report from ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, saying that by not adopting climate responsibility by 2050, it could mean that any country in Latin America a structural loss of 25% of the GDP. So the economy will sanction us. And we have to explain to our economies, to our government, to our decision makers, that this is an economic process. So it is the only way in which we can evolve into that. And here we have a deputy minister from Azerbaijan. We have to take advantage that, I think it was in Madrid in COP25, we got for the first time ever a meeting of the Coalition of Ministers of Finance for Climate. But we are not working with them. We are not convening them. We are not doing the climate debate something that it must be in the core of the Ministries of Finance. We are still thinking that this is for the Ministry of the Environment, that are the tiny piece of the government. I used to be Minister of the Environment. I know how tiny we are when it is about the full cabinet. We need, as it was mentioned by Francesco Lecamera, we do need to evolve into new governance structures. We do need to think about ecological transition. We do need to integrate energy to the environment and to climate. That's the only way. Because if not, the NDCs and all of that, it will continue being something from the Ministry of the Environment. We don't care. No, it's there in the corner. No, it has to be a strong element of the national or domestic policy. But also, and I think that it was mentioned by you, Yves, we have to raise the adaptation agenda. when we think about mitigation and adaptation, we are far away in sense of distance. And yeah, there could be many reasons. The outcome for an adaptation initiative, it is a long term, it is difficult to measure, no, there are not clarity and not enough resources to do it, and that is why I hope that COP29 could focus on the global goal on adaptation, in progressive with the global goal on adaptation, in defining criteria, indicators, in defining ways to measure, because that is the only way in which also we can raise money for the adaptation. Because if we put in a scale mitigation and adaptation, wow, it is so different. And it is not fair for the most vulnerable people that there are not resources. We are celebrating the loss and damage funding mechanism, and even more that now the World Bank will host that funding mechanism. But how much money it has? 35 million? How much money the US put on the table? Peanuts. That is fair for the people who are suffering? It is not. We have to raise our voices. We have to say, this is about adaptation because there is clear evidence on what does it mean, the climate change consequences. But also it is good to have new sectors into the debate and have all of those sectors defining pledges and have all of those sectors fulfilling with their pledges. But it is not just about cities or transport. It is also the hard-to-abate sectors, steel, cement, maritime, among aviation, among some others. It is good that we are strengthening the presence of food security, as it was mentioned today, health into the climate debate. We have to convene the full economy into be part of this debate. I will take some more minutes. And it is true, President of Mauritius, that convergence with nature, it is a key element. And fortunately, that is happening. Net zero, nature positive, the two sides of the same coin. We do need to work on that in strengthened tools to address climate change, nature loss, because we know how connected they are. And also, you mentioned, Jean, during your moderation, you asked, I think it was, to some of the panelists, what exactly it is this new collective quantified goal, no? The NCQG, so difficult acronym. Means exactly what the acronym it is telling us. It is not just about money, because 100 billion is nothing. Alok mentioned 100 trillions, even more. So when we think about this new collective quantified goal, we must think that it must be additional. It should help to achieve current and future tasks. It must impulse actions. It must be collective. So it should be connected to the CBDR. And we should guarantee access mechanism, because that is the most difficult part for the poorest countries of the world, to access to that money. But also, it shouldn't not be focused in money, but also in all of those clear access mechanisms and the goals. It must fit with the transitions that science it is suggesting to us: energy, industry, cities and infrastructure, and finally, land use and deforestation. And let me finish with something. We have to continue developing our activism. Some of you probably reminded when former President Trump, and we haven't talked about that big elephant in the room, the coming elections in the US, and we have to talk about that. But you remember that when President Trump announced at that time in the Rose Garden that he would withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement, you remember what happened 5 days after that? That a group from the academia, from the civil society, from the indigenous people, from a business sector, launched an initiative that it was called We Are Still In. That was fantastic, because it showed how much awareness and commitment exists because of the non-party or the non-state actors. And they mentioned to President Trump at that time, I don't care on your political decision. We will continue being part of this discussion. That is a signal of hope. That is the kind of signals that we should continue sending to the world. Because if it is about climate finance, if it is about climate justice, and also this fractured and fragmented world, we have to work in each one of these referred topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you very much. And actually, you did well to remind us of the elephant in the room. I had tried to forget. If you allow me just 1 minute, I would like to ask Minister Aliyev, did we say anything useful from your perspective? What is your reaction to everything that you heard?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I would like to thank all participants for their speech and their useful, fruitful thoughts, and also would like to thank the audience for patience being with us for an hour and a half. Maybe just summing up, actually, when we look into the list of the participants here, we can see that we represent different continents of the world, but we face with the same challenges. Notwithstanding, we represent whether Southern America or IFI from Europe or another Asian region, as Mr. Binali, Yildirim, Prime Minister of Türkiye, etc. But we face the same challenge. Today we heard about the cooling off effect from the esteemed guest, Prime Minister of Romania. Today we heard about the problem, challenge regarding the cyclone Miss President of Malawi faced with in her native land. We heard about the scene, about the bearing the costs for the issues that the African countries have never done from the Madam President of Mauritius. We heard about the behavioral patterns of the people regarding the topic, discussed topic from the Prime Minister of Belgium. We heard about the emphasis should be done on education from Ms. Bokova. Also the elephant in the room from my esteemed colleague from Peru, and the Green Bank idea from my esteemed colleague from the Migration Office of United Nations. All parties, we see the problems, and as a host party, Azerbaijan, once again, I would like to repeat that, we see upcoming COP29 event as an opportunity for all of us to raise our voice about the equal and fair, equitable treatment, about the creation of the fund, a global North-South fund or something, fund or bank, any kind of international financial institution. The aim, the main focus will be on the real equitable treatment among countries around the world. It shouldn't be the case when the countries which take huge part on the pollution of the planet put, like our panel said, that a bunch of peanuts on the table and they get back most of them. It should be fair and equitable, and I would like to ask all my colleagues to submit, to give their proposal, their vision to us, Azerbaijani side, we would like to give them together, to bring them together, and to raise our voice during the COP event to be held in November in Baku. I would like to thank you all. Thanks.
So, thank you all very much, and thanks to the whole panel. And I would like to leave you with the point that Ugochi made at the very beginning. Let's forget we must put people first. So I thought that was a great point and very important. Please, let's clap to this great panel. Thank you all very much. And the picture.